Hello, and welcome to this online version of the Introduction to Documentary Studies. This works for independent study or distance learning. I'm happy to have you here with me, Joy Salyers. Today's unit is going to be what I like to call a speed history of documentary film. And I do just want to say before we get started, I use the term speed history intentionally. I don't want you to feel like this is some comprehensive overview of the history or of the genre. This is to get you started, hopefully give you some ideas for where you might like to research further or dive in and explore a little more, and hopefully point out some dots and connect them that help you kind of think about films that you encounter and about how this history may have affected the genre of documentary arts in general. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. Um, let's start off by talking about early years. And you may have seen some of the very early silent movie footage of a horse walking and running. This idea of just showing something as it was happening is kind of where documentary film started. And the most famous people to do that were the Lumiere brothers. So here's just a little example of one of their early films from 1895. I just want to show this for you a little bit. So as you can see, these are people getting off their factory, getting off work, and you can hear the piano playing there. This was a silent film, so when it was shown, it would have had some kind of accompaniment like that. The Lumiere brothers made money off these early films, and I don't know if you can really even imagine what it would be like to be able to see yourself on film when that had never been done before. But they could film all these people getting off work and then set up the projector, and they would pay to watch themselves getting off work. So this was an early example of documentary film for profit. These kinds of films they did were single shots, one camera obviously, of an event as it was happening. Like this, people getting off work or a train coming into a station. Sometimes these are called actuality films. Just an example of something that's as it's actually happening. Around that same time, 1896 and on into the beginning of the 20th century, were also process films, which, as I said, is just showing something as it's happening to kind of understand it better. The horse walking. Also, a doctor filmed about 60 surgeries that he performed, and he said it really helped him kind of correct mistakes he was making or improve his process. They also filmed people walking who had certain kinds of like neurological issues to kind of better understand the effect on the body. So that's kind of process films. And then from 1900 into 1920, you had travelogues. Sometimes those are called scenics, where you would just go to a place and kind of show what was happening there. So we go from seeing an event to seeing a process to seeing a place. We haven't really gotten into story. Um, as you can imagine, when all you have is just images and there's no sound and you don't have a lot of mobility, and you're not at this point scripting things, things like that, it can be a little challenging to figure out how to use this new genre to tell a story. So let's look at an early example of one way people played with creating meaning from these early films. This is called Manhattan. This is from 1920, and I just want to play a little bit for you, and then we'll talk about it. So I'm going to talk a little while it's playing. You can see this is showing New York City, and this strategy is really combining kind of powerful images, unusual angles to show the tall buildings, showing the smoke, this kind of the feeling of the busy city. And they've actually woven in these quotes from Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. So they're really creating a poetic sense of the city. This is kind of a cityscape, and sometimes this is considered actually a poetic documentary. There's kind of a subgenre, and we'll talk about ways of thinking of different types of documentaries a little later on. So kind of remember that this would be an example of poetic. This one's very literally poetic. It's including poetry. But basically what I mean by that is rather than trying to construct a plot narrative, they're really creating more a sense of the feeling of something, in this case the feeling of a place. It's more about kind of a lyricism and being evocative, right? So that's an example of the poetic form. And you can understand why that would be attractive when you don't have an easy way of maybe making more of a explicit kind of linear storyline. But we do see that happening in silent film, and the most famous example of that probably is Nanook of the North by Robert Flaherty. This is definitely a classic and one you should remember and know about. It follows an Inuit man and his family, and it really, you can see how this comes out of the travelogue movement, going to kind of a exotic place and making it known to viewers back at home. But he didn't want it to just be a travelogue and just a view of a place. He wanted it to have more of a story and be a little more engrossing. So I'm just going to play again a little bit of this for you so you get the flavor of it. You notice these are all available online, so I encourage you to go back and check them out in total. Well, what happened to our... Not sure what happened to our picture there. It's great to know that we can have tech issues online and at home as well as in the classroom. We'll give it just a second here to load while I continue to talk a little about Nanook of the North. So before the advent of sound in film, it was actually a lot cheaper to film on location. You know, it was kind of like have camera, will travel. You can imagine, you know, if you didn't have to haul expensive sound technology and stuff around, and you didn't have to control your environment to get good sound and things like that, it was easy just to go out and take your camera and aim it and start shooting. All right, let's see if we can try this again here. Okay, so you can see just even from this little clip that he's incorporating a lot of elements of story here. He's got humor, Nanook sliding across the ice. He's got drama. He's got characters. Um, and you saw the little, what's called an intertitle, that little, rather than a subtitle, it doesn't run at the bottom, but in between images, that little card that gives you a little piece of the story that was common in silent films. So he started to have a little bit of kind of text track to help you make sense of what you're seeing. And he's really, kind of laying out this story for you. Um, Nanook was really hailed as an example of, just really seeing the reality of someone else's life. And in that sense, I think some people talk about their kind of two early impulses in the documentary. One is to make the familiar strange. So to look at something like getting off work that is perfectly normal and something you do every day, and pausing to look at it as a dramatic moment and think of it in this completely new and different way. Um, and the other is to make the strange familiar. So to go to an exotic locale and then explain how these people are just like you, everyday people, living their lives, or to make you familiar with something that you hadn't known about before. So this would be an example of that, making the strange familiar. But it wasn't all natural. There was quite a bit of staging in Nanook. When they kill the walrus or seal with the harpoon, they really would have used a gun, which they had at hand, and Flaherty insisted that they use the harpoon. He wanted verisimilitude, this kind of sense of authenticity. And of course, the irony there is it was less authentic to what was actually their lived reality. He wanted a sense of an authenticity that was really about probably 100 years earlier, how they would have lived. But he wanted them to be authentic to the expectations of the audience back home. So we can see even here in 1922 how filmmakers are adjusting reality to fit the different stakeholders, in this case, what the audience wants or expects. A couple other examples, the Nanook wasn't his name, for one thing. His name was much longer. The woman presented as his wife in the film was not really his wife. In fact, I think she was the filmmaker Flaherty's common-law wife. And most famously, there are some scenes inside their igloo, and they come across as being very intimate and really getting kind of an inside look into, what their domestic life was like. And in order to film those shots, they had to kind of build a special igloo that didn't have a roof so that they could get the equipment down in there. And Flaherty really defended this and said, his kind of quote was that a filmmaker must often distort a thing to catch its true spirit. And you might just kind of jot that down and remember that and think about that idea as we go through the class, because it will certainly come back up. Are there times when a documentarian has to change the reality of something from a technical standpoint in order to really give a true sense of what it was really like? So in this case, he's saying, I wanted people to be able to see this intimate space and what it would have felt like, and the only way to do that was to have it be fake, in a sense, to have the igloo be partially kind of artificial. So that's a interesting kind of stance and argument on either side, and you can think about what where you would fall on that. Another very influential early example of documentary film is the newsreel tradition. And this started in about 1908 and went on into 1960. Really, it was the advent of television news programs that ended newsreels. If you think about it, until then, the only place people could get video news, you'd hear news on the radio, but to get video news, you had to go to the movie theater until people had televisions in their home to watch it there. So here I'm going to show two examples. This is an early example from Paramount News, which was a very big newsreel producer, and this is around 1925. And you see this is about Charles Lindbergh. You notice, again, it's silent. You've got these intertitles giving you the story. When people watched it, there would have been a piano or something playing to provide the music. So now I want to compare this to newsreel just 10 years later, after the advent of sound, and then talk a little bit about the effect of sound.
The gigantic Norris Dam comes through the winter a step nearer completion. The staccato echoes of clattering machines and the shouts of thousands of busy workmen have resounded through the valley of the Clinch River for nearly 2 years as work has been rushed forward to complete one of the country's largest power and reservoir dams by 1936. Built of huge cement blocks, the walls of the new dam tower into the sky like mighty modern pyramids. This great dam and hydroelectric plant will harness the raging spring floodwaters of the Clinch and Tennessee rivers. Water will be provided for irrigation purposes in the Tennessee Valley for years to come.
Okay. Um, so a couple of things maybe stand out to you here. One is how familiar the sound is to us. We're just kind of used to being told a story in this way. The advent of sound really started right around now in the late 20s and was not a moment. There was not kind of a now sound has become the thing. It was more of a progression on into the late 1930s before sound kind of became expected to be part of documentary film. And, you know, if you think about it, we're all used to seeing those Super 8 home movies that were silent, right, on into the 1960s. So it wasn't unusual to have film with or without sound in this kind of in-between period. But, you know, what happens is the idea of sound very quickly becomes the idea of speech. So rather than it just being sound of, in this case, the dam, instead we go immediately to a kind of voiceover, this voice of God, in fact, kind of omniscient narrator telling you what the story is. And it's not a far stretch from this, and you can see how they're shaping the story just in this little piece we watched talking about the Great Dam. It's like the pyramids. It's going to do this wonderful work for years to come. You can see how it moves from that into propaganda pretty easily. And here, in fact, this was if you noticed, a Chevrolet newsreel, and at the end of this newsreel they talk about all the Chevy trucks that will be involved in building this great dam project. So you start immediately kind of with sponsorship and who's framing the message and how they're telling it to you and what they have to gain from it. And we'll talk a little bit later on about the idea of stakeholders in a documentary and who are all the people who kind of have an agenda or have a goal, have a stake in the project. And so here you see where sponsors definitely do. So often students ask me about a definition for propaganda and when does a documentary become propaganda. And really, actually, the word propaganda comes from the Roman Catholic Church. It comes from the Latin word for to propagate the faith. And so propaganda just means a very persuasive explanation that's designed to sway people to your point of view. And so in that sense, every commercial is propaganda. Of course, that word really got a negative connotation during the World Wars when we saw a lot of newsreel footage and longer documentaries designed to create stories that some people felt were not true, were partial, that they were very slanted. And so we really think of propaganda as being kind of an unfair or immoral level of point of view, of slanting, of controlling what information is shared so that you're only telling people your side of the story. So that's a good thing to think about as you think about your own work, is where's the line for you between a persuasive argument and what starts to feel dishonest or like propaganda, and how do you want to make sure that you avoid that. So a couple famous examples of early propaganda films would be Triumph of the Will in 1935, which was commissioned by Adolf Hitler, and Why We Fight in 1942 to 44 by Frank Capra. So you can kind of look at those if you want some examples. Another thing that came out of this news photojournalism kind of tradition started with a man named Robert Drew. And Robert Drew had been an editor for Life magazine's kind of day in the life photo essays. And I'm going to show you a few photos from a photo essay by W. Eugene Smith, who we may talk about more when we talk about photography. And I would encourage you to learn about him anyway. But this is a very well-known photo essay from Life magazine called Nurse Midwife, about a woman named Maud Cullen. And Eugene Smith would go and follow a person, in this case a midwife. Another very famous one he had was a country doctor, and sometimes follow them for 3 weeks and just make pictures of their daily life, of their job, of what it was they were doing, and then they would be published in Life magazine. And so Robert Drew, who was a photojournalist and an editor who worked on things like this, was really intrigued by what a video version of this kind of photojournalism would look like. And he formed the Drew Associates to explore that. And they had a TV show in the early 1960s for ABC called Close Up that was basically designed to take this day in the life photo montage idea to a video level. They also made feature-length documentaries, and I'll show you a trailer for a famous one of theirs called Primary. This is about the campaign race between JFK and Hubert Humphrey.
Thank you very much. I got your vote?
Yep.
How far is it, Doyle?
Well, it'll take half an hour to get over there.
Makes you sleepy. Yeah, and speaking right afterwards.
Well, just put your head back and take a little nap.
It's a great dream, the dream of becoming President of the United States. This is the story of the primary process, as it is fought in any important state, in any election year, but seen close up, as there's never before been captured by the camera. The names could be Taft, Wilkie, Kefauver. This happens to be 1960, Wisconsin. Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota against Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy.
Primary, very risky. But in my judgment is I never could have been nominated if I hadn't run in primary, so I'm taking the risk. But I would say you have to keep coming up sevens.
The farmer all around is taking a shellacking. The money in the till is the thing that is lacking. Get rid of the strippers, your troubles will cease. Put Humphrey in the White House and use our food for peace. Yes, vote for Hubert.
So this is a very famous documentary called Primary. They also made one called Crisis. And a couple things about this that you should remember. One is that it started a genre in the United States that's called direct cinema, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. It also built on this idea of what's sometimes called a crisis structure. So the idea behind direct cinema is that you go out and you just film something as it's happening. You let it unfold in front of you. You don't script it, you don't direct it. You just really capture it as it's happening. And if you're going to do that, you can imagine that it's really helpful if you have an event to document that both is guaranteed to have some drama and also has a schedule that's kind of known. So you know when it's going to be worth your time to go set up and film. And so things like political campaigns were very useful for that. Some other examples would be sports contests, following the team to the championship, for example, and music. So following a music group on a tour would be another example. So all of those kinds of documentaries, which now are really well known, all kind of come from what Drew Associates created. And this is kind of a subgenre itself, this political process documentary. So a man named Richard Leacock had been an assistant to Flaherty, who made Nanook of the North, on a film called Louisiana Story. And he is one of the people who joined Drew and Associates and worked on this film primary. And later, Leacock made the film War Room, which is about the first Clinton campaign. So you can also see, as you start putting these dots together, how different documentarians have been affected by others and how these different threads have come down. And another thing that's interesting to do, if you have a particular director or filmmaker who you really like, look at who they apprenticed with or where they got their early start, and then look at that person and trace that back. And you can often see these same kinds of threads and dots to connect for yourself. One other example, when Richard Drew put together this group, Drew Associates, he got a collection of filmmakers and photojournalists to do this work, and so it really became kind of a workshop of documentary filmmaking. And two other guys who joined his team were Al and David Maisels, brothers. And they kind of got their start with Drew Associates, and later they went on to make Grey Gardens and Salesman and Gimme Shelter, all of which are extremely well-known, famous documentaries, and all of which use this kind of model of just letting something unfold in front of you. So let me talk a little bit about kind of direct cinema and what its techniques were. Again, this was invented in the U.S. It really had the goal to remove the barriers between the subject being documented and the audience. So they wanted to make you feel like a fly on the wall, just kind of seeing this thing happen in front of you. And so some of the ways they did that, they used raw footage and sound. They used no voiceovers. You heard a voiceover in this because it was the trailer. But in their actual films, they didn't have this kind of omniscient voice of God narration. They had natural lighting, so they wanted it to be very unscripted, not directed. And the filmmaker was really invisible because they didn't want you to be thinking about the construction of the documentary. They wanted you to be really there in the room with what was happening. Now, a slightly different example of something that's similar to this is called cinema verite, and you've probably heard of that, and often people use these two terms interchangeably, but cinema verite is different a little bit than direct cinema. It started in France in the 1950s and 60s, so around the same time, and they're both examples of what's called sometimes observational documentary, which means you don't tamper with what's happening, you don't script it. But in their case, the camera is always acknowledged. So verite means truth, truthfulness, and so the idea of cinema verite is to be as truthful as possible and for the film to be free from deception. And so this kind of comes out of, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle that says if you're present, you're changing things. So just by you being there for the experiment means you're going to change the results of your experiment, right? So in their mind, if you being there filming is by necessity going to change what you're filming, it is more honest to show yourself and to acknowledge that you're there, so that the viewer isn't kind of given this false sense that you're presenting something that's true in some larger way than you can really make a claim for. And maybe most famous early example of cinema verite is Chronique d'un été, Chronicle of a Summer, which follows several people in Paris, and I just want to show you a little bit of the beginning of this. It's in French, so you may not be able to understand it.
Tu vois, Morin, l'idée de réunir des gens autour d'une table est une excellente idée. Seulement, je ne sais pas si nous arriverons à enregistrer une conversation aussi normale qu'elle le serait s'il n'y avait pas de caméra. Par exemple, je ne sais pas si Marceline arrivera à se décontracter, arrivera à parler absolument normal. Il faut essayer.
Moi, je crois que j'aurais pas mal de difficultés.
Pourquoi?
Parce que je suis un peu intimidée.
Vous êtes intimidé par quoi?
Je suis intimidée parce que... à un moment donné, il faut être prêt, puis je ne suis pas forcément.
En ce moment, vous n'êtes pas intimidé.
Okay. So what you can notice about this is that they're actually starting the film off 2 minutes into the film with a discussion about whether it's really possible to record something without changing it. So he's saying, you know, we're going to try this, and I don't know if it's possible to enregistrer, to record in a normal enough way that we don't affect people. And he turns to the woman and says, like, for example, how about you? Do you feel like you're going to change, you know, for the camera? And she says, well, I think I'll be a little intimidated. So they're putting all of this right in front of the camera and in the film. And so sometimes it's seen as being a little in your face. They'll come out with the microphone and kind of get in people's face and ask them a question. So they want to make sure that you as the viewer know that they're instigating this conversation. They don't want to hide that. So some people say if direct cinema is like a fly on the wall, that cinema verite is more like a fly in your soup. It's like, we're here and we're going to make sure you know that we're here. But both of these do have some things in common in that they rely on the advent of more portable equipment that makes it possible to really go out kind of on the fly and do things like follow around a presidential campaign. They focus more on characters than plot. You can imagine if you're really going to follow someone and really delve into what's going on with them from day to day, it's going to become a rich character study. They focus on the everyday and sometimes even the mundane. So if you think about that primary trailer, you know, the windshield wiper going, to create a sense of the exhaustion and fatigue of a campaign by showing a lot of very small everyday moments, taking a nap in the back of the car, you know, riding on the bus. So a different way of storytelling than focusing in on a particular event and really documenting it. But these are really capturing all of these everyday moments. And that's true of all of the examples of what's sometimes called observational cinema. Interestingly, one of the students of Al Maisels was Ross McElwee, who is famous for making the documentary Sherman's March. And that really started the genre of autobiographical documentaries, where not only is the filmmaker acknowledging their presence in the film, but it actually becomes about them. So in an autobiographical doc, the filmmaker kind of engages in a personal quest for the camera. So done with my clips, and I think you can see I meant it about a speed history. I want to close by reviewing a few categories of documentary film. And I want to say, before I do that, I always say trying to describe the types of documentary film is like trying to break down a pie. You know, you can do that in lots of ways. I can say, here's the list of ingredients. I can say, let's cut it into 8 pieces and look at each piece. We can talk about the layers, the whip topping, the filling, the crust, the pan, etc. None of those is the one definitive correct way to analyze a pie or talk about a pie. And in the same way, there's not one definitive correct way to break down documentary film. So I don't want to give you the false impression that this is some kind of, you know, given thing inscribed in history. You've got to remember that documentary film just kind of happened over this this century of time. And the theory came later. People came in and tried to describe it, categorize it, analyze it, looking back. And so this is taken from one author, Bill Nichols, and I'll put up his books in a minute here for you in case you want to read them. But he kind of gives 6 types of documentary film, and I'm including 5 here. The 6th is a little more esoteric, and I just don't want to get into it. But these, I think, are useful, and you can think about them often as you're looking at the documentaries you enjoy. So I just want to review them, and you'll see how they connect back historically, but all of these are examples in current film as well. So poetic, you remember we saw the film of New York, Manhattan. So poetic documentaries tend to be more fragmented, more impressionistic. They have a lyrical quality. It doesn't mean they include literal poetry, although that example did. They're going to sometimes use montage or kind of a collage effect. So it's more artistic than plot-driven, really trying to give you a sense or being evocative. And there's some great examples of that in current documentary film. They can be quite beautiful. Expository really is maybe what we think of as the typical doc in a way, and it really comes from those newsreels. Here is the story, and I'm telling you what the story is, and I'm telling you what it means. So it has an authoritative commentary. It's got a very strong point of view, and the images in an expository documentary are almost like the quotes in an academic paper. They're the evidence for the argument. So that's one thing you want to be careful of when you're making documentary film, is that you are not reducing your images to just sticking in to say, here's the quote, and especially that you're not taking them out of context or changing the original intent of them to do that. But the way that you should kind of understand the story or read the information that's being given to you is strongly suggested in an expository documentary. Here is the story, and this is how you should understand it, and this is why. So you think of somebody like Michael Moore, for example, has a very strong expository style. Observational, as we've just reviewed, you have these different schools, the direct cinema school, the cinema verite school, and these go on today, but they have this quality of immediacy, really getting into the intimate moment. They arose out of a desire to be not as abstract as a poetic documentary can be, but to not be as didactic as an expository documentary is, and to really try to get more to a sense of what's really happening and capturing it as it unfolds, rather than constructing an argument and then going out to film things to prove your argument. And as I mentioned, they tend to emphasize human character over plot. That's partly because you don't know what the plot's going to be if you're not scripting it. But of course, that doesn't mean there's not drama in these kinds of documentaries. Then participatory, and really this connects not only to that moment in cinema verite of saying it's more honest to show that we're here, but also connects to social sciences like anthropology, and the realization that early descriptions of ethnographies, descriptions of people in other places, were presented in this kind of expository way. Here is what you need to know about this community in Papua New Guinea or wherever, and you can believe me because I'm the expert and this is my evidence, right? And there was a rising understanding in the 60s and 70s that objectivity really isn't actually possible. And so some people felt like, if that's true, then pretended objectivity is dishonest. And it's better to be honest about our subjectivity and to say, yes, I have a point of view. I'm affecting this by being here, instead of trying to pretend that that's not true. So participatory documentaries draw on this advent in anthropology and other fields of being a participant observer, of documenting it and also being part of it. So the filmmaker becomes part of the story, and there's a wide range in what that looks like. It can be everything from just letting the camera see you or not editing out your questions in the interview, for example, all the way to the documentary really becoming about you, which is true in the autobiographical docs that we mentioned earlier. So there's a wide range of what participatory means. And these categories, it's important to note, are not exclusive, right? So going back to Michael Moore, for example, you can see he also does participatory docs. He's always part of his story. So you can be, a film can be a participatory doc and an expository doc, for example. And the last category I want to talk about is reflexive. And that just basically means that the documentary asks questions about the act of documenting itself. So it ponders things like, do we really have the right to tell other people's stories? Or what are the implications of documenting poverty? What do we need to think about if we're going to do this work ethically, right? The documentaries that kind of ask those types of questions. And we saw this kind of reflexivity in the beginning of Chronique d'un été, when he says, you know, is it possible to record people talking without, in such a natural enough way that we don't change what they're talking about or how they do it? That's a reflexive question. And the cinema verite movement tended to be more reflexive, more self-reflective. In general, another thing they often did was screen films first for the people who they had documented to get their feedback. And that's an example we'll talk about later of kind of power sharing and wanting to be reflective and look back at yourself in an honest way. As you can imagine, those of us who teach documentary arts love reflexive documentaries because they ask great questions that we like to ask students to ponder and talk about. So you may notice in this class that you experience several examples of reflexive documentary. So I'm going to leave you with this screen that you can copy down or pursue at your will. Those types of documentary are drawn from Bill Nichols' work. He has two really great books, Introduction to Documentary and Representing Reality. And you might enjoy reading his work about documentary film and its history. And these are the films that I showed you clips of, all of which are available on YouTube or on Vimeo, and I encourage you to go and check them out. So the Lumiere Brothers, Manhattan, Nanook of the North, by Flaherty, Primary, and I'd really suggest too to just Google the Drew Associates and go to their website. I have lots and lots of examples of their work and of the people who've worked for them. It's very interesting. And Chronique d'un été. And then I want to leave you with a little plug for a fantastic and fun way of learning more about the conventions of different documentary genres, which is the TV series Documentary Now, which started on IFC but is now available also on Netflix. And it is a hilarious send-up of famous documentaries. It's a very loving kind of spoof, but you can learn from watching the spoof about, you know, what the conventions of the original genre are. And they've done one that's a spoof of Nanook of the North. They've done one that's a takeoff on Grey Gardens. And so it's really fun, and I think you would enjoy it. So thanks for sitting through the speed history of documentary film, and I hope you'll stay tuned for the next unit.